Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, whenever you are listening to this. Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. Here is the ministry where we dive into books and we connect. This is the book that we are connecting with. As you can see, John is holding up The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W.Tozer. You are very welcome to click the link in the description to come with us on this journey and read the book with us. We go through 3 chapters at a time or thereabouts, and then we kind of analyze, agree, disagree, share our thoughts on a few things, and see if we can go deeper, specifically in this case, into the knowledge of God. I'm joined with Dee and Matt and John. Thanks very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to connect with you today. We're going to focus on chapters 13, 14, and 15. Chapter 13, the divine transcendence. Let's open it out. I wonder if anyone had anything that struck out to them in chapter 13 that you would like to share. So I'll hand over the floor to you guys. Anyone want to dive in first?
Let's start with Dee. She said she had something. I'm curious.
Oh, you bet. The only thing that I had is on page 84.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes on about I think in the Bible, people had this great awe of God, and how he in some way I think that it was more of a fear versus respect or awe. And then he goes on to say at the end of page 84, how in our modern times, right, in the very end, it says, conversely, the self-assurance of modern Christians, the basic levity present in so many of our religious gatherings, the shocking disrespect shown for the person of God are evidence enough of deep blindness of heart. And I honestly have to disagree with this statement. Like, I was reading this and I couldn't help think, I was like picturing, I know this is just very superficial, but I was, how we come to church nowadays, like when I was a little, right, we were taught to always dress in our best dresses.
Sabbath best.
Sabbath best, right. And we even on every Friday, we even like cleaned our house inside out, top to bottom, to prepare for Sabbath. And all of that it had, I think, good meaning to it. But in our modern times, look at the way we come to church. We don't think about that kind of stuff. We don't really give much. I mean, it's perfectly okay to come to church in jeans, and in the summer we come to church even in shorts, and I don't see anything wrong with that. So to say that that in our modern times that that's just a deep blindness of our heart. I don't want to look at our outer appearance or how we call on God, because in the next page in 85, it goes on to say how we just misuse his name a lot, even when we call him dear God or whatever it is, good God. I don't want to look at those outer appearances and judge and say, well, you must not have respect for God, or you're just not being holy toward God, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So that's the only thing that I had.
I think what you're sharing is just a representation of the fact. I just think another example of him being a bit black and white in the way that he's coming across. You see, on one hand, I get what he's saying. I do kind of agree with the reality that we've, I guess, lost a semblance of respect in some regards, but that's only because here's where the fine line is drawn. Because I did this exercise once with a bunch of people where we were supposed to write down one pronoun that we felt described our relationship with God, and some people put down father, some people put down brother, whatever it is, and I put down friend. Like that was the first thing that came into my mind of how I see him. There's this little niggling voice behind me that wonders if by categorizing God as a friend, I am minimizing him. And I know that's not true. It's like the upbringing that is speaking to me, telling me, no, he's more than that, Sam. He's way more than that. And I think the purpose of this chapter is trying to highlight God's transcendence, i.e., God exists in a completely different dimension that humanity exists. We don't measure him in the same way that we measure human beings and that kind of thing. But there's that fine line. There's that fine line where we see God like us, even though he is not like us, even though he wants to be relatable enough to be related to, as if we are one-on-one. So that's my struggle, left, right, and center. Anyway, yeah, I don't know anyone else.
And in John, Jesus tells the disciples, you are no longer servants, you are friends. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's a biblical basis for that. I mean, I get what you're saying. I get kind of what he's saying. And I mean, you can read his prayers, which each of these chapters has a prayer at the beginning, and there's a lot of thee and thou. So there's no question he comes from a different age.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. We don't want to minimize God, but we still, I mean, that's what's so beautiful about Jesus, is that you see a God that you can interact with as you would interact with a friend. And he says that's okay. In John, he says, you can call me friend. So that's just my thought on that.
So, sorry, Matt, I think you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wonder, hearing all you kind of bring this up, my mind kind of goes to, would it fall under the idea of transcendence, that in the Bible, there are so many names and descriptions that are there for God, right? And it's not a bad thing to say that God is your friend.
No,
it's maybe bad to say that he's only your friend, right? So is it part of transcendence to say that, your father is always going to be your father, and it's hard to break out of that, but God is so large that all of these names do apply. He is our ruler, but he's also our friend. And so I don't know, I wonder if that, trying to tie that into the idea of transcendence.
Yeah, I like that idea.
I know why that is, though, on many different respects, because we have inherited a singular picture of God through our traditions. I'll give you an example of how that's backed up. You all know the story of when the ark was carried in the Old Testament, and then the ark slipped out of someone's hand, and then the guy just wanted to help the ark back up, put his hand out. Uzzah, that's it, and then he was struck dead, and thus becomes the basis upon which we should act in front of God forever. I think we single God out into specific ways of relating to human beings, rather than accepting that he is a God in the totality of the human experience. I'm just supporting your point, Matt, to say he's not just my friend.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting to me that he names Daniel as kind of an example of someone in the Bible, but we've talked in the past. I mean, the Bible is very paternalistic, and it's got this huge bias towards Israel and the Jews.
Yep.
And so, Daniel is someone that, was recognized during the Babylonian captivity of 70 years, along with about 6 other people. And he's holding this man up and saying, we should all be like him. And Daniel's literally surrounded by pagans that don't even believe in God, and have more respect for, idolatrous gods and images than they do to the true God. And yeah, I mean, it is good that Daniel did what he did, but I guess people that recognize God on any level are people that God can work with, as opposed to people that don't recognize God on any level. And I don't want people to think that I'm okay with levity, but in some ways, I think God's okay with levity. I mean, so the other thought I had is The Chosen, that talks about Jesus, and I followed it, and there is something very appealing to me about a Jesus that interacts with his disciples through the good and the bad. And it's, 24/7, and there's a certain amount of levity there that Jesus displays himself as God, but it's with his interactions with the disciples, and it doesn't diminish him as God. If anything, it holds him up because he's holding the rest of humanity up, which is ultimately why he came to earth, is to show us that God was a God of love, and not like the pagan gods where, you make a mistake and you're killed by God.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is definitely that. I can speak as I've developed in my theology from a child to an adolescent to an adult. I can see how my theology has changed so much based upon how I have seen who God is and how real he is to me. I actually went to study theology. Like, I spent my time in books, just trying to fill in myself with all these words and history and development of theology, to come out on the other side just still wanting a friend. I'm not saying that I don't value him as a teacher. I don't value him as king. I don't value him as all these different things. The greatest yearn within my soul is for a God who decides to walk right next to me. And maybe I need to take more of an effort to recognize that he is so transcendent, but God, as much as he is so transcendent and so bigger and so outside of my dimension, he is at the very same time so close to me. So close to me. And maybe that's the greatest paradox about who God is. None of these attributes are good enough to describe him in one sense.
Yeah, and then the irony is on page 83. So the one quote I had was that second full paragraph, where he says that it is God himself who puts it in our hearts to seek him, and makes it possible in some measure to know him, and he is pleased with even the feeblest attempts to make him known. And so that's where, on this page, God is pleased with the feeblest attempts, but then he's hammering people on the next page, that have, a basic levity. And I don't know.
No,
I think you need to be careful.
You actually mentioned a really important point that just sparked something for me. I think we can all be confident in agreeing that God's grace is so sufficient for anyone who wants to try and get to know him, whether it be someone who is non-educated or educated, and there are many other scales. Where God might be comfortable with that, where God's grace is sufficient, I cannot say that humanity are the same. Because at least in the church tradition that I've grown up, I have felt a never-ending pressure that one person's perspective is simply just not good enough as to where they are and how they're relating to God. There's this constant pressure that you need to academically know him more. There is this constant pressure that you need to theologically understand him more, so that your knowledge is sufficient for your salvation, so to speak. But anyway, that's some of the dynamics that definitely popped out for me. Any more on that chapter, or shall we move on to chapter 14? Okay.
The omnipresence of God.
That's right, the omnipresence of God. Did anyone have anything that struck out to them in this chapter? I can set the ball rolling and say there was a hint of theme that went through this chapter that got me a little bit nervous. And that was the theme of where I felt like Tozer was just tipping on the edge of pantheism. And for those who are listening, pantheism is the idea, not just that God is everywhere, omnipresence, but that God is in the very thing. So in this book that I am holding, I'm not just saying that God is present as I'm holding this book. I'm saying that God is actually made up of this book and part of this book. I don't think Tozer was trying to say that. I just think Tozer was very, very close to saying that. And I just, at least for me, it was important that I made that distinction, because I don't think God wants to ascribe himself as a created being. He's bigger and much more larger than that. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Anyone want to respond or add something different?
This was kind of I don't know, this chapter didn't really connect with me because I think I just have always assumed it. Like this omnipresence has just been one of those things that I don't know, in my assumption of who God is, that is just such a key characteristic that I don't know that I would think otherwise from it. I could see, I'm a play devil's advocate with Tozer. I could see that, like, if I was trying to, I could see the temptation would be there. Like, if you're so comfortable with this idea that you're trying to describe it, you know, get people enthusiastic about something, does it, you can really come up really close to that idea of what you're doing, you know, pantheism. And I agree, that's a no-go, but how do you really just get beyond just saying God's everywhere? He's with us all the time without like, it's a hard chapter to write on. I would have a very hard time saying much more than that right there, I guess.
Say much more than God is everywhere.
Right. I agree with Matt. I can see how you could have concern about pantheism, but I didn't feel like he was even really pushing the line. I think it's interesting because it does appear that Tozer is struggling with some of the things God is, and he's talking about these attributes.
Yeah.
And I mean, honestly, a lot of these are words we never use except in the context of a deep dive study with God.
Sure.
And to be able to write it so that it's even somewhat understandable to someone, I think would be difficult. The only real quote that jumped out at me was on page 87 and kind of just right below the halfway point, where he's talking about Christian theology, claiming to have answers. And he says that the world is spiritual. It originated in spirit, which I think we can agree with. It flows out of spirit, which I think we can agree with. It is spiritual in essence. And I think it at least initially was until sin entered. And it is meaningless apart from the spirit that inhabits it. You know, I don't think that's pushing pantheism. I think it's saying that, you know, what God does is spiritual in every sense of the word.
Right.
I think you have to agree with that. And I think that's what he was saying is, you know, the world originally started that way. And God's spirit is still in this world. It may be a little harder to find because of sin, but it's certainly there.
Yeah, I tend to agree. There wasn't much in this chapter that caused me to think, yeah, I didn't know that. I maybe it's because of our tradition as Christians. We're schooled in this. We already know these kinds of things. Dee, anything to add, or shall we swiftly move on to chapter 15?
Well, in the bottom of page 88, where it says the certainty that God is always near us, present in all parts of his world, closer to us than our thoughts, you know, should remain us in a state of high moral happiness most of the time, blah, blah. I mean, I think my first reaction, I don't know why, but I couldn't help taking it to I guess more darker place of thinking that, you know, if God is indeed truly with us everywhere that we are at, and I'm thinking, you know, if I was in a situation where, you know, something bad was happening to me, and God being there, you know, how, if I in that moment, if I were to remember it, or if I were to feel his presence, even like, what would I be thinking? How would I be feeling going through that bad situation? That's the thought that I had, that just entered my mind. And then I went, where I went with it is like, I'd be like, wondering, God, why aren't you intervening? Why aren't you doing anything about this? And I think we've all been there, but that's where it took me. I don't know.
Well, honestly, you've just articulated the difficulty of my prayers recently. I go to different events, I'm at church or whatever it is, and we hear it all the time. Pray for Ukraine. And someone would come to me and he said, Pastor, can you, like this week, I recorded, someone asked me in London, they asked me to record a prayer for one of their services, and I recorded a prayer. And my question, as I responded to them, I was preparing that to record that prayer. So what would you like me to pray for? And it was a very real question, because I'm just like, I'm still working out what am I praying for exactly? Because I'm not sure what I'm praying for. I guess there is the generic, Lord, will you please be with them? But you raise a very important point, Dee. Wanting God to be present in our lives in the most difficult of instances doesn't resolve for us. Only if our expectations are for him to intervene physically and change the setup and circumstances of how we do life. But there is resolution if our expectations are slightly different of this God. And that's the challenge of Christianity right there. The expectations that we have of an omnipresent God.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you're absolutely onto something here. So often our expectation is, God, there's this problem and there's this solution, and you're the one that can bring them together. But then all of a sudden, I'm playing God, and the expectations need to be, you're in control, be with me and lead and guide me, no matter, what happens with the problems, and no matter what I think the solutions are, you're always going to have the best resolution to any situation. And if that's the expectation, then you pray that God is with you and can support you through that.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do. I mean, it's easy to sit here and say, well, that's what you should do. But when you're in the middle of something, it's a lot different. I mean, he does mention that in 88, a little farther down, he says, Christians sometimes know what it is to suffer, even in the conscious presence of God. And so you can be in the presence of God and suffer. And it's, I don't know. I don't like suffering any better than anyone else. But if you're going to suffer and God's with you, it's certainly a lot better than suffering and not having God with you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I think we're all just resonating on the truth and the reality of how difficult it is to be a human being in this world with everything that's going on. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right, then let's go to chapter 15, the faithfulness of God. I can't remember where, but I remember it's somewhere in this chapter where he communicates this thought, which I thought was interesting. And this is what I wrote down. God's immutability gives us the logical extension that he's faithful.
Yeah, that's on page 91, the second paragraph, the last sentence. It says, if he is unchanging, it follows that he could not be unfaithful, since that would require him to change. I think he bombed on this chapter. I'm sorry. It's just, I mean, you think about all the different ways you can talk about God's faithfulness, and he turns it into like an algebraic formula. And exactly like you said, God is immutable. God does not change. Therefore, God is faithful. Otherwise, he'd have to change, be unfaithful. I mean,
come on, John. I don't think he's proved himself so far as the most person who's leading it by his heart in this whole book. This isn't for the heart people. This is for the head people.
Well, yeah. And I'm not necessarily a heart person. I mean, you guys know that by now. But at some point, you got to get out of your head and into your heart. and I don't know. I wasn't in a bad place when I read the chapter. It's just my thought afterwards was, you have the Old Testament, you have the New Testament. It's basically documentation of what God is like, and God's faithfulness in all of those scenarios. And he doesn't really pull out any of those things.
No, he doesn't. He leaves it as an academic study, it seems. I was challenged in this chapter. There wasn't a place where I could stand on what he was presenting as compelling for a case of God's faithfulness and as to why I would want it. But I do think that there was one thing that he brought up, which I thought was interesting, at least. And I'm not going to read all of it because it's basically the bottom of page 91 and the two top paragraphs of 92. I'll just skim through it. He says, it might be demonstrated that almost every heresy that has afflicted the church through the years has arisen from believing about God things that are not true, or from overemphasizing certain true things so as to obscure other things equally true. I think he's talking about just localizing the idea of God upon one attribute or two attribute, which I thought was very interesting. He gives one example about, where does he say? Here we go, where he talks about the Bible teaches that God is love, and some have interpreted this in such a way to virtually deny that he is just. And he goes on with a few more examples here and there. There was some truth in that, at least, I can definitely say. I think our church have been so centered on this academic God that I think our traditional church would probably resonate a lot with Tozer, because he's so academically orientated. But I think within our movement, we have really tried our best to mature over time to develop this loving connection with a God who is a being who wants to be part of us, and conjoin the reality of all of his attributes, which helps us understand, to have a more total picture of not just love, but love and justice, and a few others here and there. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts. What do you guys think?
Go ahead.
No,
go ahead. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I was gonna say, this is probably the one, that sentence that you just read was kind of the high point, and it probably shouldn't have been, because it's not even quite about God, but it's more church critique.
Yeah.
But that was the part that really stuck out to me most. Like, wow, does this explain everything? I think it's maybe 60% there. In that I think it probably is a pretty true statement. I'm going to try to keep the cynicism away from any specific examples. It's a true statement, I think, for honest searchers of God. It falls apart for the other 40% or so when you get into the human heart merged with where it ceases to become about God, but it's still of the church. I mean, history is full of all kinds of literal crusades that have been taken in names of the church, right? And steps that have been taken in the names of the church that you could make a pretty good argument are just as big of heresy in some ways, but were never, some of those decisions and things were never even about God, nor do I think they were ever intended. It was about human power, ego, whatever it may be. So that's where I kind of came back, is I was initially like, that's a pretty good statement he's making. And I could see that we fall so often for like, I love this one aspect of the Bible, and this is where I'm going to focus, and even to the point of denying other parts. I think it's very insightful, and we do it all the time, but I think it leaves out more. I think about that one other part of just human evil or self. So.
I had a little think about it, and I asked myself the question. I looked at what I see and how the Adventist church has developed over time. I think by and large we're a traditional church in many respects. I asked myself the question, I wonder what attributes we make primary in our movement. That was the question that I thought to myself of.
What
They're
is
the
it?
things that
I
make it
don't know.
embarrassing to be an Adventist. Oh, you're the
What is it?
religion that doesn't smoke and doesn't drink.
No,
And
no, well, no.
you don't
I'm talking
eat
about
meat.
attributes of God. I'm talking about what attributes of God define how we perceive Him. Like we make it
As a
all
church?
about Him. Yeah.
Oh,
So for
interesting.
so
Because
I thought
I was going to say, Matt is right. That statement is true, but it has to do about churches and not about God. I mean, and it's not an argument for the faithfulness of God. You know, the unfaithfulness of churches is not an argument for the faithfulness of God. But what are you getting at, Sam?
I'm getting at the idea that it's possibly an it's possibly a view that we see Him as an omnipotent God, and it's very much about He is powerful and He will destroy. I don't know if I'm particularly onto something. I'm just thinking that if it were that, it would color everything in terms of how we do theology, how we think about Him, but it would also color how we view faithfulness as well. Because
it used to be probably that way.
Yeah, probably. I'm just
Not
saying
anymore.
I'm just saying that the idea of faithfulness, under the lens that He is only a all-powerful God, doesn't leave much room for a graceful God, is what I'm trying to say. And I think over the years, we have grown to balance that out. I'd like to think we've grown to balance that out to try and look at even more attributes. John, you were umming and ahhing. Is that a disagreement?
Well, no, I was, because I think D was saying with some confidence that the church is doing a lot better. So I'd like to hear that, D.
No, I don't have anything else to. No, I don't have anything else to say about that, because it's just from my personal experience. I know that Seventh Adventist as a church, as a denomination, I think it's been a lot of this God all powerful and just coming down on you, and there'll be a at the end time there'll be a punishment, judgment, all of that. But I feel like as a whole, the Seventh Adventist denomination has moved away from that. I feel like far away from it, and it's much more based on love and mercy. Yes, still there's justice and there's judgment at the end, but it isn't that all scary, that kind of thing any longer.
I do appreciate that me postulating that is about recognizing we all have different experiences of Adventism.
Yeah, that's true.
And so we all approach it in different ways.
So
but yeah, anyway.
The other reason, well, so on page 92, almost dead center in the page, Tozer says, "We need not fear to let the truth stand as it is written." And I thought that was powerful, because, the first thing was like, well, is there truth that I fear, and I fear enough to not let it challenge me and ultimately change me? And then I thought you were getting at the same kind of thing with the church, but I'm still not entirely sure that's what you were getting at.
I was just trying
truth the Seventh-day Adventist Church still fears enough that it's afraid to make changes that it needs to be made based on that truth?
Well, I wasn't going there, but I'm glad that you drew that parallel. Let's make the connection then, and let me answer where I think you're answering the question. Seventh-day Adventism fundamentally were first categorized as a movement, and it was one of our greatest strengths that we could ever carry to our name in our history. A movement, by definition, moves. We change. We started with a few fundamentals. We thought, oh, let's add a few. We realized there was a few things. No, that's not right, and then we changed a bunch of things. We were constantly in flux. I think we're more scared to be in flux now than we used to be. I think that there's a lot going for us. If we go back, I'm going to use an age-old phrase that Adventists will at least understand, is to go back to basics in the reality of learning how to be a movement again and not a denomination, because the two are markedly very different. I think there is so much value in being part of a community that understands that we try to get things right. We try to get some illumination. Sometimes we get things a bit wrong, but we move and we shift and we are malleable in that respect. I think the bigger organizations get, the less malleable they become. And I think Absolutely. That it's healthy, at least for us on a local church level, to do inventory on our own individual lives and our own individual small local church levels, to really challenge and grow. I think it's Ellen White who says truth does not lose its value under inspection. And I think it's up to us to be able to push into that and go deeper. There's the value of being part of a local church. Yeah, I know that we're part of a global, 20-something million people across the globe, but there is huge value of being part of a local church because it gives you the latitude to be able to go deeper, to challenge and to ask questions. And that's definitely a kind of community I want to encourage. That's definitely something I want to be a part of, because it's only in the struggle of being malleable, accepting that you need the humility to know that you may not get everything right. Can you actually grow? And God can illuminate you. So that would be my answer to that in the growth of that. And I would say that God has the latitude for that. That's my final statement on that.
I think that was George Knight's point, that that was supposed to be it started as a movement, was supposed to continue to be a movement. But like you said, I think that we grew, we got comfortable, and we became a denomination. My last thought on this chapter is that the faithfulness of God is actually one of my favorite attributes of God. If I had to choose, and
probably you could say it more eloquently than Tozer, I think.
No, I don't think so. But the reason because I think the personal application for me is when I think about God's faithfulness, it to me, it means that he's going to show up, that he will always do as he said,
right,
and that he will never disappoint me. I think to me, that's what it means. And so, we live in a world where, a lot of times words are just cheap, and to have a God like that, to know that I have a God like that, that's for me personally, that's really comforting. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, and that's the same God we see in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. So, I agree with what you're saying, Dee.
Yeah,
definitely. Did you have anything to add, Matt?
No, I think a pretty good summary has been given here.
Cool.
This week just felt like a lot of self-obvious stuff, and in some ways to me, and so it was hard felt like Tozer was kind of struggling to get a lot of these concepts out in some ways, and he probably had a little bit easier time earlier in the book where we actually had to kind of explain definition, but
definitely. Well, guys, I think that brings us to a conclusion of today's episode. We want to thank you who have been joining us online on this journey that we have been making. Next week, we'll be looking at chapters 16, 17, and 18. Chapter 16, the goodness of God. Chapter 17, a juicy one, the justice of God. We'll see how juicy that is. And chapter 18, the mercy of God, and also another juicy one. If you want to click the link in the description, it'll take you to where you can buy the book. John, if you could just hold it up for us. This is the book that we're going through, The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W.Tozer. But for us, this is saying good evening until our next episode. May God bless you, and we look forward to spending that time with you. Bye.